Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones we carry in silence. Caleb Stone had buried 2 wives and believed he'd never be a father, that something inside him was broken beyond repair. On the edge of a dying frontier town, he took Martha Brennan as his wife. She was poor and heavy-set, a woman the town mocked without mercy. But Martha had a gentle heart and a quiet strength that didn't need anyone's approval. When she discovered she was carrying his child, the impossible became real. Everything Caleb believed about himself was wrong. This is the story of 2 overlooked souls who found redemption in each other. What happened next will restore your faith in second chances. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1878, and Bitterroot, Montana existed as little more than a stubborn smudge on the vast canvas of the frontier. It clung to the eastern slope of the Rockies, like a barnacle to a ship's hull, weathered, grey, and slowly losing its grip. Once, during the brief fever of silver speculation, the town had swelled with hope and bodies. Now both were in short supply. The main street consisted of a general store, a saloon that doubled as the boarding house, a blacksmith's forge that only fired up twice a week, and a church that saw more use as a meeting hall than a house of worship. Caleb Stone lived 17 miles north of town, where the pine forests grew thick and the mountains rose like ancient sentinels, guarding secrets too old for telling. His cabin sat in a clearing he'd carved from the wilderness with his own hands, a simple structure of weathered logs, chinked with clay and moss. Smoke rose from the stone chimney in a thin, steady column, most mornings the only sign of human habitation for miles in any direction. He was 42 years old, though his face carried the marks of a hard account. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his eyes held the particular weariness of a man who had seen too much loss and expected more to come. His hair, dark brown, threaded with premature grey, hung past his collar. He kept a beard more out of practicality than preference, one less thing to tend to in a life stripped down to essentials. His hands were scarred and capable, the hands of a man who had built, buried, and survived. Caleb made his living trapping beaver and marten, hunting elk and deer, selling pelts and meat to the general store in Bitterroot. It was solitary work, which suited him. The mountains asked nothing of him but respect and vigilance. They didn't pity him or whisper when he passed. They didn't remind him of all he'd lost. In the cabin, tucked inside a wooden chest beside his bed, lay a worn leather journal. He opened it rarely now, though there had been years when he'd written in it every night. The pages held pressed flowers, delicate blooms, carefully preserved between sheets of thin paper, columbine from Sarah's grave, wild roses from Emma's. He'd picked them every spring for 7 years after Sarah died, 5 years after Emma followed. Then he'd stopped going to the cemetery altogether. The flowers had seemed like a promise he could no longer keep, a tenderness that had curdled into something that hurt too much to hold. Sarah had been his first wife, 17 years old to his 23, the daughter of a farmer in Wyoming Territory. She'd had honey-colored hair and a laugh that made him believe the world might be gentler than he'd thought. They'd married in the spring, and by winter she was with child. Caleb had built a cradle from pine wood, sanded it until it was smooth as water-worn stone, lined it with furs he'd tanned himself. He'd never felt such hope, such terrifying joy at the prospect of becoming a father. Sarah had labored for 2 days. The midwife had done everything she knew, but the baby, a son, had been turned wrong. When it was over, Caleb had buried them both in a meadow where Sarah had liked to pick wildflowers. The cradle he'd burned, unable to bear the sight of it. Emma had come into his life 3 years later, a widow who understood grief. She'd been 30 to his 26, practical and kind, with steady hands and a calm manner that soothed the ragged edges of his sorrow. They'd built a quiet life together, and Caleb had been grateful for it, even if it lacked the wild hope he'd known with Sarah. Emma never conceived, which had seemed like both a relief and a quiet disappointment. Then, one February, a fever swept through their camp. She'd been gone within a week, her body consumed by a heat he couldn't break, no matter how many cold cloths he pressed to her skin. After Emma, Caleb had moved north into the Montana Territory. He'd built his cabin in the most remote location he could find, and he'd made a silent vow. No more wives, no more hope for children. Whatever was broken inside him, whatever curse or failure lived in his blood, he would not inflict it on another woman. He would not stand over another grave holding flowers and regrets. The town knew his story, or versions of it twisted by time and gossip. They called him the Widow-maker, though never to his face. They said he was cursed, that he carried death in his shadow. When he came to town for supplies, people gave him a wide berth, speaking to him only when necessary, their eyes skittering away from direct contact. Caleb didn't mind. He'd come to prefer the silence. Martha Brennan occupied a different kind of silence, in Bitterroot, the silence of being overlooked, dismissed, mocked. She was 34 years old and had lived in the town for 6 years, ever since her parents' farm had failed and her father had died of a bad heart. Her mother had followed him within the year, leaving Martha alone with nothing but a few pieces of clothing, her mother's silver thimble, and the skills she'd learned at her mother's side. She made her living as a seamstress, mending clothes and occasionally sewing new garments when someone could afford such luxury. She rented a small room above the saloon, paying her landlord with whatever coins she could scrape together from her work. It was never quite enough. She was perpetually 2 weeks behind on rent, perpetually on the edge of eviction. The town women treated her with casual cruelty. Martha was heavy, her body thick through the middle, her arms soft, her face round. In a place where survival often meant going hungry, where hard work carved people down to bone and sinew, her size marked her as different, other, somehow less deserving. That she was also poor made her an easy target. The women whispered that she ate more than she earned, that she was lazy, that no man would ever want her. They said these things loudly enough for Martha to hear, softly enough to deny if confronted. Martha bore it with a dignity that cost her more than anyone knew. She kept her head down, her voice soft, her opinions to herself. She smiled politely at insults and thanked people for their business, even when they complained about her prices or found fault with her work. She'd learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. The world had already decided what she was worth. Her job was simply to survive it. But there was a strength in Martha that had nothing to do with physical power or social standing. It lived in the careful precision of her stitches, each one even and tight. It showed in the way she stretched a bag of flour across 2 weeks through sheer creativity and will. It resided in her ability to find small beauties, a sunset, a bird's song, the smell of bread baking, and let them matter, even when everything else hurt. She had kind eyes, brown and deep-set, that saw more than people realized. And she had gentle hands that had nursed her dying parents, that created beauty from scraps of fabric that had never once been raised in anger or spite, despite every provocation. Caleb Stone first truly noticed Martha Brennan on a cold afternoon in late October. He'd come to town for supplies, his pack-horse loaded with pelts to trade. He'd been standing in the general store, waiting for the proprietor to tally his goods, when he'd heard laughter from outside, the sharp, cutting kind that wasn't joyful but mean. Through the window, he saw 3 women gathered near the church steps. In their midst stood Martha, her arms full of fabric, her face carefully blank. One of the women, the banker's wife, was speaking loud enough for half the street to hear. "It's a wonder you can even reach the needle over that belly, Martha. Perhaps you should spend less time eating and more time working. Then you might actually pay your debts on time." The other women laughed. Martha said nothing, just shifted her burden and tried to move past them. One of the women deliberately stepped into her path. Caleb felt something stir in his chest, a heat he hadn't experienced in years. Anger, yes, but something else too, recognition perhaps. The understanding of what it meant to be marked by a town's judgment, to carry a weight that had nothing to do with body and everything to do with how people saw you. He watched Martha finally slip past the women with a quiet "excuse me" that should have shamed them, but didn't. He watched her walk down the street with her head up, her pace steady, refusing to run or cower. And in that moment, Caleb Stone saw something he hadn't seen in another person for a very long time. He saw dignity. Real dignity, the kind that couldn't be given or taken away, that existed independent of circumstance or cruelty. He collected his supplies in silence, loaded his pack-horse, and rode back into the mountains. But something had shifted. The image of Martha Brennan stayed with him through the long evening, through his simple dinner, through the hours he usually spent in comfortable solitude. That night, for the first time in 3 years, he opened his leather journal. He didn't write anything. He just looked at the pressed flowers, at the careful script recording dates and small memories. And he thought about what it meant to be broken and what it might mean to be whole. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the high peaks with a fury that caught even the old-timers by surprise. By mid-November, snow lay 3 feet deep in the passes, and the temperature dropped so low that spit froze before it hit the ground. Caleb made one last trip to town before the worst of it set in, knowing he wouldn't be back until the thaw. He arrived on a grey afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of more snow. The main street was nearly deserted, most folks hunkered down in whatever shelter they could claim. Caleb tied his horse outside the general store and pushed through the door, grateful for the blast of heat from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. The proprietor, a thin man named Gus Mercer, nodded in greeting. "Stocking up for the long dark, I expect." "That's right." Caleb handed over his list: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, lamp oil. The essentials that would see him through to March. While Gus gathered the supplies, Caleb wandered to the window, looking out at the empty street. That's when he saw Martha Brennan emerge from the saloon, moving quickly despite the ice underfoot. She carried a small bundle wrapped in brown paper, her worldly possessions, he realized with a sinking feeling. Behind her came the saloon keeper, a thick-necked man named Pritchard, his face red with more than just the cold. "You got 3 days, Martha," he shouted after her. 3 days to come up with 2 months' rent, or I'm throwing your things in the street. I don't care if it's Christmas. I don't care if it's 10 below. You pay or you're out." Martha didn't turn around, didn't respond. She just kept walking, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "Probably run off to eat someone else's food," Pritchard muttered, loud enough to be heard. "God knows she's had enough of mine." 2 women standing near the saloon entrance tittered at the comment. One of them, the Reverend's wife, a woman who should have known better, called out, perhaps if she spent less time at the table and more time at the needle, she could afford her keep. Caleb's hands tightened on the window frame. He watched Martha turn the corner toward the church, her shoulders straight despite the weight of humiliation she carried. "Shame about Martha," Gus said quietly, appearing beside Caleb with an armful of goods. "She's a good woman, does fine work, just can't seem to get ahead of things. Why's she behind on rent?" Gus shrugged. "Not enough work, mostly. Town's dying, and folks don't have money for mending when they can barely afford food. Plus, some of the women—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some of them would rather see their clothes fall apart than give Martha their business. They think they're better than her. Because she's poor. Because she's heavy." Gus met Caleb's eyes. "Cruel, ain't it? Woman can't help how she's built, and the town treats her like she's committed some kind of sin just by existing." Caleb said nothing. He paid for his supplies, loaded them onto his pack-horse, and stood for a long moment in the street. The wind had picked up, driving needles of ice into his face. In 3 days, Martha would have nowhere to go. In this cold, with no shelter, that was a death sentence. He should ride out. He should head back to his cabin and let the town sort out its own problems. Martha Brennan wasn't his responsibility. He'd sworn off attachments, sworn off caring about anyone who might make him feel something other than the safe, numb isolation he'd cultivated for years. But he kept seeing her face, that careful blankness that hid so much hurt, kept hearing the dignity in her. Silence when any other person would have screamed or wept or fought back. Before he could talk himself out of it, Caleb walked to the church. He found Martha inside, sitting in the last pew with her bundle beside her. She was sewing something by the weak light from the windows, her needle flashing in steady rhythm. She looked up when his boots echoed on the wooden floor, and for a moment something like fear crossed her face. "Mr. Stone." She set down her sewing and stood, smoothing her worn skirt. "Can I help you with something?" He'd rehearsed what to say on the walk over, but now the words stuck in his throat. "How did you propose marriage to a woman you barely knew? How did you explain that it was practical, not romantic, that you needed someone to keep house and she needed a roof, and maybe that was enough?" "I heard you're being evicted," he said finally. Color rose in her cheeks. "I'll manage. I always do. It's 20 below out there, going to get colder, I'm aware of. The weather, Mr. Stone." Her voice was soft, but firm. "If you've come to offer charity, I appreciate the thought, but I'll decline. Not charity. I'm offering marriage." The needle slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a tiny ping. Martha stared at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. "I have a cabin 17 miles north," Caleb continued, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "It's warm, well built. I'm gone trapping most days, but the work of keeping house is substantial. Cooking, preserving meat, tanning hides, mending. I could use help with it. In exchange, you'd have shelter, food, safety, and a name, if that matters to you." "You're serious?" It wasn't a question. "I am." "Why?" Martha's hands twisted together. "You don't know me, Mr. Stone. We've never exchanged more than a greeting. Why would you offer me such a thing?" "Because I know what it's like to be judged for things beyond your control," he thought. "Because I saw how you walked, away from those women with your head high, and it reminded me that strength comes in forms most people don't recognize." What he said was, "Because it's practical. We're both alone, both outcast in our own ways. Seems like we might do better together than apart." Martha studied him for a long moment. He could see her thinking, weighing options that probably all looked equally grim. "You know what people say about me. I know what they say about me too. Doesn't make it true. I'm not." She paused, and he saw her gathering courage. "I'm not beautiful, Mr. Stone. I'm not young. I'm not small or delicate or any of the things men usually want in a wife. I'm not asking you to be those things. Then what are you asking? Honesty. Hard work. Someone who won't run off at the first difficulty." He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with the vulnerability of what he was about to say. "I've been married twice before. Both my wives died. I don't." His voice roughened. "I don't expect love, Mrs. Brennan. I don't expect children. I'm offering a partnership, nothing more. A business arrangement that benefits us both." Something flickered across Martha's face, hurt, maybe, or disappointment. But it was quickly replaced by the practical calculation of a woman who knew when to take the only lifeline being offered. "If I say yes, I want to be clear about my terms," she said quietly. "I'll keep your house and do the work you need. But I'll not be treated as less than human, Mr. Stone. I've had enough of that to last a lifetime. If you expect a servant you can mock or mistreat, you'd best withdraw your offer now." "I expect a partner," Caleb said. "Nothing less." Martha reached down and picked up her mother's silver thimble from her sewing kit. She held it in her palm, looking at it like it might hold answers. "My mother told me once that marriage should be about more than survival," she said softly. "She said it should be about building something together, about finding someone who sees you for who you really are. Your mother sounds like she was wise." "She was." Martha closed her fingers around the thimble. "She was also practical. She'd tell me that sometimes survival is enough to start with. That you can't build anything if you're dead. She looked up at him, and Caleb saw tears in her eyes that she refused to let fall. I accept your proposal, Mr. Stone. When would you want to marry? Tomorrow, he said, before the next storm hits. The wedding took place the following afternoon in the same church where Caleb had proposed. The Reverend performed the ceremony with obvious reluctance, his wife standing witness with a pinched expression that spoke volumes about what she thought of the union. Gus Mercer attended as well, perhaps the only person in town who seemed genuinely happy for them. Martha wore the same worn dress she'd been mending, but she'd pinned her dark hair up with careful attention, and she carried a small bunch of dried flowers someone had left in the church meant for decoration, but she'd claimed them as a bouquet. Caleb had washed and trimmed his beard, put on his cleanest shirt. He spoke the vows in a steady voice, slipping a simple gold band onto Martha's finger, one he'd purchased that morning from the general store, using nearly all the credit from his pelts. When the Reverend pronounced them married, there was no kiss, no embrace, just a solemn nod between two people who had agreed to face an uncertain future together. They left town within the hour, Martha's few belongings tied behind Caleb's saddle. She rode his pack-horse, sitting astride in a way that would have scandalized the town women if they'd seen, but they were already beyond caring what the town thought. The ride to the cabin took 4 hours through deepening snow. Caleb led the way, and Martha followed without complaint, though he could tell she wasn't accustomed to riding. When they finally emerged from the tree line and the cabin came into view, smoke rising from the chimney where he'd banked the morning fire, Martha drew in a sharp breath. "It's beautiful," she said, and he heard genuine wonder in her voice. It wasn't beautiful. It was simple, rough, isolated. But maybe she was seeing what he saw, a place of safety, of silence that wasn't loneliness, but peace. Caleb dismounted and helped Martha down from her horse. For a moment they stood in the snow, this unlikely pair, married but still strangers, bound by need more than affection. "Welcome home, Mrs. Stone," he said quietly. Martha looked up at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. It transformed her face, bringing light to her eyes and softness to features worn down by years of hardship. "Thank you, Mr. Stone," she replied. "I'll do my best not to disappoint you." As he showed her inside, introducing her to the simple space that was now hers as much as his, Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Not love, he wouldn't call it that, but perhaps the first small crack in the wall he'd built around his heart, the first possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could survive caring about someone again. He didn't know yet about the miracle growing inside her, didn't know that everything he believed about himself was wrong. That knowledge would come later, in ways neither of them could predict. For now, there was just the warmth of the fire, the quiet of the mountains, and two people learning to share a space neither had expected to share with anyone again. January brought a false thaw, 3 days of warm Chinook winds that melted the top layer of snow and filled the air with the smell of wet earth and pine. Caleb used the break in the weather to bring in more firewood and check the trap lines he'd set farther out. Martha opened the cabin windows to air out the stale winter smell and washed their linens in melted snow water. On the second day of the thaw, while organizing Caleb's belongings in the loft to make room for additional storage, Martha found the leather journal she hadn't meant to pry. The chest it was in had been left open, and the journal lay on top of a folded blanket, clearly visible. Martha knew she should close the chest and walk away, respect Caleb's privacy. But something about the worn leather cover, the way it had been handled so many times the edges were soft, drew her attention. She opened it carefully. The first pages were filled with neat script recording, trap locations, weather observations, supplies needed, practical entries that read like accounting. But then the writing changed, became more personal, and pressed between the pages she found them the flowers. Delicate blooms carefully preserved, their colors faded but their forms still recognizable. Columbine, wild roses, Indian paintbrush, each one marked with a date and a name. Sarah, Emma. Martha sat down on the edge of the loft, the journal open in her lap, and began to read. Sarah laughed today when I brought her the columbine. She said they looked like tiny birds frozen in flight. She wants to plant them near the cabin when the baby comes. Says she wants our son to grow up surrounded by beautiful things. The entry was dated 2 months before Sarah's death. Martha turned the pages slowly, reading Caleb's private grief. His hope and fear laid bare in ink. He wrote about Sarah's difficult pregnancy, his growing worry, his prayers that everything would be all right. The entries stopped abruptly after her death, just a single line. Buried them both today. I don't know how to go on. Then, 3 years later, the journal resumed with entries about Emma. These were different, less passionate, but deeply affectionate. Emma mended my coat today. Fixed it so well you can't even see where it was torn. She has capable hands, a practical mind. I'm grateful for her presence. The entries about Emma detailed a quieter love, born of shared grief and Doherty's mutual understanding. Then came the fever, described in increasingly desperate entries as Caleb tried everything he knew to break it. The final entry was dated the day after Emma died. I am cursed. 2 wives, both gone. I will not risk another. I will not be the death of someone else I care about. Martha's hands trembled as she closed the journal. This was Caleb's deepest wound, not just the loss of his wives, but his certainty that he was somehow to blame, that something in him brought death to those he loved. She heard the cabin door open below, Caleb stamping snow from his boots. Martha? His voice carried up to the loft. She quickly returned the journal to the chest and climbed down the ladder. Caleb was unwrapping the scarf from around his neck, his face ruddy from the cold. Find what you needed up there, he asked. Martha met his eyes, and she knew he could see the truth on her face. I found your journal. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude, but it was there, and You read it. It wasn't a question. Yes. She wouldn't lie to him. I'm sorry, Caleb. I should have respected your privacy. He was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he moved to the hearth, stirring up the fire. Probably should have told you about them anyway. About what happened. You don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. I'm ready. He sat down heavily in his chair, and Martha took the seat across from him. Sarah died in childbirth. The baby, our son, was breech, and the midwife couldn't turn him. They both died, and his voice caught. I built that cradle, sanded it for weeks, and then I burned it because I couldn't stand to look at it. Oh, Caleb. Emma died of fever. Nothing I did made any difference. I tried everything, cold cloths, willow bark tea, everything. But the fever just kept burning until there was nothing left of her. He looked at Martha, and she saw the raw pain in his eyes. After that, I knew. Something in me is wrong. I can't father children, can't keep a wife alive. You're not cursed, Martha said firmly. How do you know? Because curses aren't real. Tragedy is real, bad luck is real. But you didn't kill your wives, Caleb. Sarah's baby was positioned wrong, that happens, and there's nothing anyone can do about it sometimes. Emma caught a fever. People die from fevers all the time, especially out here where help is scarce. Neither of those things was your fault. I should have done more, should have gotten better help, should have what? Changed things beyond your control? Martha leaned forward. Listen to me. You did everything you could. You loved them. You tried to save them. And when you couldn't, you carried that grief like it was a weight you deserved to bear. But it's not. You're not cursed, Caleb. You're just a man who's lost too much. He was silent, staring into the fire. As for not being able to father children, Martha continued, her voice gentler now, did any doctor ever tell you that? Or did you just decide it must be true because Sarah's pregnancy ended badly? We tried for 2 years with Emma. Nothing happened. 2 years isn't that long. Some couples try for 5, 10 years before conceiving. And maybe Emma just couldn't. There are women who can't bear children through no fault of their own or their husbands. Caleb shook his head. You're making excuses for me. No, I'm giving you the truth. The truth you've been too buried in grief to see. Martha reached across and took his hand, the first time she'd initiated physical contact between them. His hand was warm and calloused, strong despite his certainty of his own brokenness. You're not cursed, Caleb Stone. You're wounded, yes. Grieving, absolutely. But you're not broken beyond repair. He looked down at their joined hands, and something in his face began to crack. Not breaking, but opening. The careful wall he'd built, around himself developing its first real fracture. I wanted children, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Wanted them so badly with Sarah. Thought maybe with Emma, but after nothing happened, I convinced myself it was for the best. Safer that way. Less to lose. And now I don't know what to think. He met her eyes. You should know, Martha, if you're hoping for children from this marriage, you'll be disappointed. I can't give you that. Martha felt her heart constrict. She'd been feeling different lately, odd sensations in her body that she'd been trying not to think about too carefully. A tenderness in her breasts, a slight queasiness in the mornings, the absence of her monthly courses, though that could be explained by the stress of her circumstances changing. But what if it wasn't stress? What if it was something else? She pushed the thought away. Too soon to hope, too dangerous to tell him when he was so certain of his own incapacity. I'm not disappointed, she said instead, and it was partially true. I married you for safety and partnership. If that's all we ever have, it'll be more than I had before. But even as she said it, Martha knew it was a lie. She wanted more. She wanted the possibility of a family, of children, of a future that held something beyond mere survival. She just couldn't tell him. Not yet. Not until she was certain. That night, they shared a bed for the first time. Not in passion, but in comfort. Caleb's nightmares had returned with the conversation about his wives, and Martha had heard him thrashing in the loft. She'd climbed the ladder and found him tangled in blankets, calling out Sarah's name. She'd woken him gently, and without discussing it, they'd both understood that he couldn't be alone. They lay together in the narrow bed, not touching but close enough to feel each other's warmth. Caleb's breathing gradually slowed, steadied by her presence. "Thank you," he murmured into the darkness. "For what?" "For not running. Most people would run from a man with my history." "I'm not most people," Martha said. "And besides, I've got nowhere else to go." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. Honest, at least. Always. She paused. "Caleb, those flowers in your journal, do you still visit their graves?" "Haven't in years." Seemed pointless. "Maybe come spring, we could go together, pay our respects. Not because you owe them anything, but because they were part of your life, and that matters." He was quiet for so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. "Then, I'd like that." They drifted off together, two wounded people finding unexpected comfort in shared space and honest words. And in Martha's womb, unknown to either of them, a small cluster of cells continued to divide and grow, creating a miracle that would change everything they believed about themselves and each other. By late February, the patterns of their life together had solidified into something that felt permanent, almost comfortable. They shared the bed in the loft now, though their physical intimacy remained chaste, holding each other through cold nights. Caleb's arm draped protectively over Martha's waist, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. Martha had begun work on a quilt, piecing together scraps of fabric from both their pasts, an old shirt of Caleb's that had worn through at the elbows, a piece of her mother's Sunday dress that she'd carried with her from town, fabric from the blankets that had covered Sarah and Emma. She worked on it in the evenings, her needle moving in steady rhythm, while Caleb carved or read aloud from his books. The quilt was becoming a map of their joined lives, different pieces that shouldn't have fit together, but somehow did, creating a pattern that was stronger than any single scrap alone. But Martha was keeping a secret, and it grew heavier with each passing day. The morning sickness had started in earnest. She'd wake before dawn and slip outside, retching quietly into the snow while Caleb still slept. She blamed it on bad meat, on a sensitive stomach, on anything but the truth that was becoming impossible to ignore. Her body was changing, her breasts were tender and swollen, her waist was thickening, though she tried to hide it under loose clothing. And her monthly courses, which should have come twice since their marriage, had not appeared. She was pregnant. She was certain of it now. And she had no idea how to tell Caleb. He'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced that he couldn't father children. He'd built his entire understanding of himself around that belief. What would it do to him to learn he'd been wrong all these years? That he could have had children with Emma, that the impossibility he'd accepted was nothing more than bad timing and circumstance? Would he be happy? Or would it destroy him, opening wounds that had barely begun to heal? Martha lay awake at night, feeling Caleb's breath warm against her neck, and tried to imagine the conversation. Every version of it ended badly in her mind. One morning, the sickness was particularly severe. Martha barely made it outside before her stomach rebelled. She knelt in the snow, shaking and miserable, trying to be quiet. "Martha?" Caleb's voice came from the doorway. "You all right?" "Fine," she managed, wiping her mouth with snow. "Just a stomach upset." He came closer, crouching beside her. "You've been sick a lot lately." "Have I?" She tried to keep her voice light. "I hadn't noticed." Caleb studied her face, concern evident in his eyes. "You're not fine. You're pale. And you've lost weight." He paused. "No, that's not right. You haven't lost weight. You've just—" Martha saw the moment understanding began to dawn. His eyes dropped to her midsection, then back to her face. "You're not sick," he said slowly. "Are you, Caleb? Are you pregnant?" The words came out harsh, almost accusatory. Martha's throat tightened. "I think so. Yes." He stood up so fast he stumbled. "That's not possible." "Apparently it is." "No." He was backing away from her. "No. I told you. I can't. I've never— You were wrong." Martha got to her feet, her legs shaky. "I'm sorry, but you were wrong about that." Caleb's face had gone white. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for a few weeks. I've been certain for maybe 10 days. And you didn't tell me?" "I was afraid." The words burst out of her. "I was afraid of exactly this, of how you'd react, of what it would do to you, what it would do to me." His voice rose. "Martha, do you understand what this means? If you're pregnant, if you're carrying my child—" He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. "It means you can be a father. It means you were never broken. It means I could lose you." The anguish in his voice cut through the cold morning air. "Just like Sarah. Just like the baby. I could lose both of you, and I—" His voice cracked. "I can't survive that again, Martha. I can't." She wanted to go to him, to comfort him, but something in his posture told her to stay where she was. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump or step back. "You won't lose me," she said. "I'm strong, Caleb, stronger than you think. Sarah was strong too, until she wasn't. I'm not Sarah. I know that." He turned away, his hands clenching into fists. "God, I know that. But it doesn't change the fact that childbirth kills women. Especially out here, miles from any doctor, any help. What if something goes wrong? What if— Then we'll deal with it," Martha said firmly. "Together. But living in fear of what might happen won't change anything. The baby's coming, whether we're afraid or not." Caleb was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, defeated. "I need to think. I can't talk about this right now." He walked past her, grabbed his rifle and pack from inside the cabin, and headed into the woods without another word. Martha stood in the snow, watching him go, and felt her heart break a little. She'd known he would struggle with this, but seeing the depth of his fear, his certainty that this would end in tragedy, it hurt more than she'd expected. She went back inside and sat by the fire, her hands resting on her still flat belly. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the life growing inside her. "I'm sorry your father's so afraid, but he'll come around. He has to." But as the hours passed and Caleb didn't return, Martha began to doubt. What if this was too much for him? What if the fear of loss was greater than his ability to hope? She pulled out the quilt she'd been working on and forced herself to keep stitching. The steady rhythm of the needle calmed her slightly. Each piece of fabric joined to the next, creating something whole from fragments. That's what they'd been doing. She and Caleb piecing together a life from the broken remnants of their pasts. But what if this news had torn the quilt apart? What if the pattern they'd been creating couldn't hold against the weight of his fear? Evening came, and still Caleb hadn't returned. Martha made dinner, though she had no appetite. She kept the fire high, kept watching the door, hoping to hear his footsteps. When full dark had fallen and the temperature dropped sharply, she finally allowed herself to worry in earnest. Caleb knew these mountains better than anyone. But accidents happened. Bears woke early from hibernation sometimes. A man distracted by emotional turmoil could miss his footing on an icy slope. She was preparing to go look for him, irrational as that would be in the dark, when she heard the cabin door opening. Caleb stood in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, his face haggard with exhaustion and something else. He looked at her for a long moment, and Martha held her breath. Then he crossed the cabin in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "I'm sorry," he said into her hair. "I'm sorry I ran. I'm sorry I'm so broken that I can't even be happy about a baby." His voice was rough with emotion. "But I'm here now. I'm here, and I'm not leaving again. Whatever happens, we face it together." Martha wrapped her arms around him and let herself cry, not from fear or sadness, but from relief. He was here. He was staying. That was enough for now. The rest they would figure out as they went. March brought the first real signs of spring water dripping from the eaves, patches of brown earth showing through the melting snow, the sharp calls of returning geese overhead. With the thaw came the necessity of bringing Dr. Halloway to the cabin. Caleb had insisted. Despite his fear, or perhaps because of it, he wanted medical confirmation of the pregnancy and professional advice on how to keep Martha safe. He'd ridden to Bitterroot alone, returning 2 days later with the doctor in tow. Dr. Halloway was a lean man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He'd been a surgeon in the war between the states and had seen enough suffering to make him both pragmatic and kind. He greeted Martha with professional courtesy, his medical bag already in hand. "Mrs. Stone, I understand. Congratulations may be in order," he said. "Though Mr. Stone here seems more terrified than celebratory." "He has his reasons," Martha replied, glancing at Caleb, who stood rigid by the door, as if prepared to flee at any moment. "So he told me. 2 previous wives, both deceased. He's worried history will repeat itself." Halloway set his bag on the table. "Well, let's see what we're dealing with. Mr. Stone, you may want to step outside for a few minutes." "I'm staying," Caleb said. "Suit yourself, but stay out of my way." The examination was thorough and matter-of-fact. Halloway asked questions about Martha's symptoms, felt her abdomen, listened to her heart and lungs. He was quiet and focused, and Martha found his calm demeanor reassuring. Finally, he sat back and nodded. "Well, Mrs. Stone, you are indeed pregnant. I'd estimate you're about 3 months along, which means the baby should arrive sometime in late August or early September." Martha felt a surge of relief mixed with fear. It was real, undeniably, medically real. "And her health?" Caleb asked, his voice tight. Will she be all right?" Halloway turned to look at him. Barring unforeseen complications, I see no reason why Mrs. Stone shouldn't have a perfectly normal pregnancy and delivery. She's young enough, strong, and appears to be in good health. But complications can happen. They can always happen, Mr. Stone. But they're not inevitable. Holloway began repacking his bag. Now, I understand you've had tragic experiences with childbirth before. Tell me about your first wife's labor. Caleb's jaw worked. She labored for 2 days. The baby was breech. The midwife couldn't turn him, and eventually, he couldn't finish. A breech presentation, Holloway said. Difficult under the best circumstances, sometimes impossible with limited skill or resources. And the midwife was qualified? She'd delivered dozens of babies? Sober? Caleb flinched. No. She'd been drinking. I didn't realize until later, but she smelled of whiskey the whole time. Holloway's expression hardened. Then, that wasn't your fault or your wife's. That was the failure of a professional who should have known better. A sober, skilled attendant might have been able to turn the baby or make decisions that would have saved them both. You were failed by someone who should have helped. The words seemed to hit Caleb like a physical blow. He sat down heavily in his chair. And your second wife? Holloway continued gently. You said she died of fever? That's right. Burned up with it in less than a week. Nothing I did helped. What did you try? Cold cloths, willow bark tea. I kept her hydrated, kept the cabin cool, everything I could think of. Did she have any other symptoms? Cough, rash, confusion? Caleb thought back. She complained of a headache before the fever started, and yes, there was a rash red spots on her chest and arms. Holloway nodded slowly. That sounds like spotted fever, carried by ticks, common in this region. Once it takes hold, there's very little anyone can do, Mr. Stone. Even in a hospital back east, survival rates are poor. The fact that you tried everything you could think of speaks to your care for her, but you couldn't have saved her. The disease simply runs its course. But I should have. You should have nothing, Holloway said firmly. You were not a doctor. You did what you could with the knowledge you had. Neither of your wives' deaths were your fault. Caleb looked at Martha, then back at Holloway. But what about... He paused, clearly struggling with the words. I never fathered a child with Emma. We tried for 2 years. I thought that meant I couldn't. May I be blunt, Mr. Stone? Please, did you and Emma share a bed regularly during those 2 years? Color rose in Caleb's face. Not as often as we might have. She was grieving her first husband, and we were both dealing with losses. Maybe once or twice a month. There's your answer. Conception requires opportunity as much as capability. 2 years with infrequent intimacy doesn't prove infertility, it proves you didn't create the conditions necessary for conception. Holloway leaned forward. Let me be absolutely clear. There is nothing wrong with you. You can father children. The proof is sitting right here, carrying your baby. The room fell silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Caleb sat with his head in his hands, and Martha could see his shoulders shaking. I've spent 5 years believing I was broken, he said, his voice muffled. 5 years convinced that I was cursed, that something in me brought death to everyone I loved. You're not broken, Holloway said. You're grieving. There's a significant difference. Caleb looked up, and Martha saw tears on his weathered face. I could have had children with Emma. If we'd just tried harder, been together more, you could torment yourself with what-ifs for the rest of your life, Mr. Stone, or you could accept that the past is past and focus on the future. Holloway stood and gathered his bag. You have a wife who loves you, though she's probably too practical to say it out loud. You have a baby on the way. You have a second chance at the family you thought you'd lost. I suggest you stop wasting time on guilt and start preparing for fatherhood. After Holloway left, promising to return in a few months to check on Martha's progress, Caleb and Martha sat together in stunned silence, the enormity of what they'd learned, what it meant for everything Caleb had believed. about himself seemed to fill the cabin like a physical presence. Finally, Martha spoke. "How do you feel?" Caleb laughed, but it came out broken. "I don't know. I feel everything. Joy that I can be a father. Grief for what I lost with Emma, for the children we might have had if I hadn't been so convinced it was impossible. Terror that I'm going to lose you the way I lost Sarah." He looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "And guilt. So much guilt. Guilt over what? Over being relieved. Over thinking that maybe Emma's death was for the best, because at least we didn't bring a child into the world, only to leave it orphaned." He dropped his head into his hands again. "What kind of man thinks that way?" Martha moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "A man who's been hurt. A man who's trying to make sense of senseless loss. But Caleb, you have to let that guilt go. You have to forgive yourself for being human, for making decisions based on what you believed at the time." "I don't know if I can." "You have to try. For me. For the baby." She placed his hand on her belly, where the slightest swell was beginning to show. "This child needs a father who believes in the future, not one who's trapped in the past." Caleb's hand trembled against her. "I'm so afraid, Martha. Afraid of losing you, afraid of failing this baby the way I feel like I failed the others. You didn't fail anyone. You loved them. You tried to save them. That's not failure, that's humanity." Martha covered his hand with her own. "And you won't lose me. I'm strong, Caleb. Stronger than Sarah was, probably. And we have time to prepare, to learn everything we need to know. Dr. Halloway will help us. We'll do this together." "Together," Caleb repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Together," Martha confirmed. That night, they lay in bed holding each other. And for the first time since learning about the pregnancy, Caleb allowed himself to feel something other than fear. It was tentative, fragile, but unmistakable hope. He placed his hand on Martha's belly and felt the warmth of her skin through her nightgown. Somewhere inside her, impossibly small and impossibly precious, was his child. A son or daughter who would never know Sarah or Emma, who would only know the family he and Martha built together. "I'm going to be a father," he said, testing the words. "Yes, you are. I want to be good at it. I want to be the kind of father who—" He paused, searching for words. "Who doesn't let fear stop him from loving completely." Martha turned to face him, her eyes shining in the moonlight coming through the window. "Then, that's who you'll be. You'll make mistakes, all parents do. But you'll love this child, and that's what matters most." "I love you," Caleb said suddenly. The words surprised them both. "I know we married for practical reasons, and I know I'm probably not what you dreamed of in a husband, but I love you, Martha, for your strength, your kindness, your ability to see good in a man who's forgotten how to see it in himself." Martha's breath caught. "I love you too. Have for a while now, though I wasn't sure I should say it." He kissed her then, gentle and sweet, and they held each other as the moon traveled across the sky, and the world outside continued its slow turn towards spring. The truth had shattered everything Caleb believed about himself. But from those shattered pieces, something new was being built, a family forged not from perfection, but from honest struggle, from fear faced and overcome, from two broken people learning they could be whole together. The journey ahead would be difficult. There would be more fear, more doubt, more moments when the past threatened to overwhelm the present. But they would face it together. These two unlikely souls who had found in each other what they'd thought was lost forever. A second chance, a new beginning, hope. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the mountains, from a monochrome world of white and grey into an explosion of green and gold. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, streams ran high with snowmelt, and the forest came alive with birdsong and the rustle of awakening creatures. Caleb threw himself into preparation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. If he couldn't control the outcome of the birth, he could at least control everything leading up to it. He began building a cradle, working on it every evening after his other tasks were done. But unlike the cradle he'd built for Sarah, the one he'd completed with joy and burned with grief, this one progressed slowly. He'd work for an hour, then set it aside, unable to finish. The wood was pine, sanded smooth as glass. The rockers were perfectly balanced. But something kept him from completing it, some superstitious fear that finishing it would invite tragedy. Martha watched him struggle with it, but said nothing. She understood that his fear was a living thing, a constant presence he wrestled with daily. Instead, she focused on her own preparations. She sewed small clothes from soft fabric, knitted tiny blankets, preserved food for the months after the birth when she'd be too occupied to cook elaborate meals. Her body grew round and full, and she moved with the careful dignity of a woman carrying precious cargo. By late May, they'd made significant progress on the abandoned homestead. Caleb had spent weeks repairing the roof, replacing rotten logs, re-chinking the walls. Martha had cleared the debris, scrubbed the floors, and begun planning where furniture would go. The stone hearth stood solid and welcoming, ready to warm the home they'd create. But then Martha's health began to change in ways that echoed Caleb's worst nightmares. It started with swelling in her ankles and hands. Dr. Holloway, who visited monthly now, noted it with concern but said it wasn't unusual. Then came the headaches, fierce, pounding pains that left Martha pale and shaking. Her vision would blur at the edges, and she'd have to sit down suddenly, overcome with dizziness. "It's the same," Caleb said to Holloway during a visit in early June. "The same as Sarah. She had headaches too toward the end. And swelling." Holloway examined Martha carefully, checking her reflexes, looking into her eyes, asking detailed questions about her symptoms. "It's not the same," he said finally. "Your wife had a breech presentation, a problem with the baby's position. Mrs. Stone's baby is positioned correctly. What she has is called eclampsia, a condition that affects some women late in pregnancy. It's serious, but it's manageable." "How do we manage it?" Caleb demanded. "Rest, limited salt in her diet, cool cloths for the headaches, and vigilance. If she has a seizure, we need to know immediately." Holloway fixed Caleb with a stern look. "I won't lie to you, Mr. Stone, this is a complication, but it doesn't mean the outcome will be the same as before. Every pregnancy is different. Every woman is different." After Holloway left, Caleb sat Martha down and made her promise to rest more, to tell him immediately if anything changed, to let him take over the heavy work. She agreed, seeing the fear in his eyes and unwilling to add to his burden. But the complications continued. Martha's blood pressure rose dangerously high. The headaches became more frequent, and worst of all, the baby's movements, which had been strong and regular, began to slow. Caleb started sleeping in fits and starts, waking every few hours to check that Martha was still breathing, that she was all right. He researched everything he could find about difficult births, read medical texts he borrowed from Holloway, studied midwifery techniques that might have saved Sarah if he'd known them then. He stockpiled supplies in the cabin, clean linens, sterile instruments, medicines Holloway recommended. He drilled himself on what to do if Martha went into labor early, if she started bleeding, if the baby came out not breathing. He prepared for every terrible possibility his imagination could conjure. And he prayed. For the first time since Emma's death, Caleb prayed clumsy, desperate prayers that he whispered into the darkness while Martha slept beside him. "Please," he'd say to whatever might be listening, "please don't take her from me. I'll do anything. I'll be better. I'll be worthy. Just let her live. Let them both live." Martha knew about the prayers, though Caleb thought he was being quiet. She'd wake in the night to find him on his knees beside the bed, his lips moving silently, his face a mask of anguish. It broke her heart to see him so afraid, but she also drew strength from it. He loved her. He loved their baby. That love, fierce and terrified as it was, would see them through. In early July, they received unexpected visitors. A wagon pulled up to the cabin. and Martha looked out to see Gus Mercer and 3 other men from town. They carried tools and supplies, lumber, nails, glass for windows. "Heard you folks were fixing up the old Morrison place," Gus said, tipping his hat to Martha. "Figured you could use some help." Caleb stood in the doorway, suspicion and gratitude warring on his face. "Why would you help us?" One of the other men, a farmer named Hendricks, spoke up. "Because Doc Holloway told us about your situation, about Mrs. Stone's condition and how worried you are. Seemed like maybe you shouldn't be doing heavy work alone when you need to be close to home." Over the next 3 weeks, the men came every few days, working on the homestead while Caleb stayed close to Martha. They finished the roof, installed proper windows, built a front porch. They asked nothing in return except coffee and whatever food Martha could spare. Their kindness moved both Caleb and Martha deeply. The town that had mocked Martha and whispered about Caleb was now offering practical support in the way frontier people did, through work, through showing up, through community. Even some of the women came, bringing preserves and bread, offering advice about childbirth that was actually helpful rather than cruel. Elizabeth Pritchard appeared one afternoon, her face tight with something that might have been shame. "I was unkind to you," she said to Martha, not quite meeting her eyes. "Before you married, I said things that I shouldn't have said them." "I remember," Martha replied quietly. "I wanted you to know." Elizabeth paused, struggling. "I wanted you to know I was wrong. You've done well for yourself, and Mr. Stone clearly values you. I hope the birth goes well." It wasn't a fulsome apology, but it was something. Martha accepted it with grace. By early August, the homestead was nearly complete. It stood solid and beautiful, a testament to what community and determination could build. Caleb and Martha walked through it together, Martha's hand resting on her enormous belly, Caleb's arm supporting her. "It's perfect," Martha said, running her hand along the smooth mantle above the hearth. Our home, Caleb agreed. But his eyes were on her, noting the pallor of her skin, the way she had to pause to catch her breath. "We should get you back to the cabin. You've been on your feet too long." The baby was due any day now, Doctor. Holloway had moved into the small room they'd prepared at the homestead, unwilling to be more than shouting distance away when Martha went into labor. He'd brought his full medical kit and every piece of equipment he might need. "I've delivered over 300 babies," he told Caleb one evening while Martha rested. "Lost fewer than a dozen mothers. Those odds should comfort you." "They don't," Caleb said honestly, "because those dozen women still died, their husbands still lost them. And his voice broke, "I can't be one of those husbands again, Doc. I can't." "Then you need to trust," Holloway said. "Trust in Martha's strength, trust in my skill, trust in whatever higher power you believe in. Fear won't change the outcome, Mr. Stone. It'll only rob you of these last days with your wife before she becomes a mother." Caleb knew the doctor was right, but knowing and doing were different things. Still, he tried. He spent his days with Martha, reading to her, talking about the future, making plans for their life in the new homestead. One afternoon, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, the place where they'd first started their unlikely marriage. Martha leaned against him, his hand resting on her belly where he could feel their child moving. "I'm not afraid," Martha said suddenly. "You should be. I'm terrified enough for both of us." "I know you are. But Caleb, listen to me." She turned to look at him. "Whatever happens, this has been worth it. Marrying you, carrying this baby, building a life together, all of it has been worth it. I want you to remember that. Don't talk like that. I'm not being morbid. I'm being honest." She cupped his face in her hand. "You gave me a home when I had nowhere to go. You gave me respect when the world gave me mockery. You gave me love when I thought no one ever would. That's a gift, Caleb. One I'll treasure no matter what comes." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I need you to live," he whispered. "I need both of you to live." I don't know how to be in a world without you anymore." "Then we'll do our best to stay in it," Martha said, with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. That night, Caleb finally completed the cradle. He worked by lamplight, making the final cuts, sanding the last rough edges, fitting the pieces together. When it was done, he stood back and looked at it, a simple but beautiful piece of furniture, made with love and terror in equal measure. He carried it into the bedroom and set it beside the bed where Martha slept. She woke as he placed it down, and her eyes filled with tears. "You finished it," she said. "I finished it," he confirmed. "For our baby, for our future." Martha reached out and rocked the cradle gently. It moved smoothly, perfectly balanced. "It's beautiful." Caleb climbed into bed beside her, and they lay there looking at the empty cradle, both of them thinking about the tiny person who would soon fill it. A person who didn't exist yet outside Martha's body, but who had already changed everything about who they were and who they would become. The next morning, Martha woke before dawn with the first contractions. She lay still for a moment, feeling the tightening across her belly, the deep ache in her lower back. Then she reached over and shook Caleb awake. "It's time," she said simply. And despite all his preparation, all his planning, all his desperate attempts to control the uncontrollable, Caleb felt the bottom drop out of his world. The moment he'd been dreading had finally arrived. The baby emerged in a rush of fluid and blood, sliding into Caleb's waiting hands. For one terrible moment, the child was silent, limp and blue-tinged, not breathing. Caleb's heart stopped. Not this. Not after everything. Not when they were so close. He remembered what he'd read, what Holloway had told him. He cleared the baby's mouth and nose with his finger, then turned the infant over and rubbed its back firmly, stimulating breathing. "Come on," he whispered. "Come on. Breathe. Please breathe." Nothing. He rubbed harder, panic rising in his throat. Behind him, Martha was asking something, her voice weak, but he couldn't process the words. All his focus was on the tiny, still form in his hands, then a sputter, a cough. And finally, the most beautiful sound Caleb had ever heard, a thin, wavering cry that grew stronger with each breath. The baby was breathing. The baby was alive. "It's a boy," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "Martha, we have a son." He quickly tied off and cut the cord with the sterilized scissors he'd store. Prepared, then wrapped the baby in a clean blanket. The child's cries were strong now, lusty and indignant, pink color flooding into his skin. Caleb carried his son to Martha, placing the baby in her arms. She looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect, and tears streamed down her cheeks. "Hello, Thomas," she whispered, naming him after her father. "Hello, my beautiful boy." But Caleb's relief was short-lived. Martha was bleeding heavily, too heavily. The kind of bleeding that had killed Sarah, that killed so many women in childbirth. "Martha, I need to deliver the afterbirth," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Can you push one more time?" She tried, but she was so weak, so exhausted. The afterbirth came away in pieces, incomplete, and the bleeding intensified. Caleb felt ice flood his veins. This was it. This was the moment he'd feared. He'd saved the baby, but he was going to lose Martha. No, no, he refused to accept that. He grabbed clean cloths and pressed them firmly against the bleeding, applying pressure the way the medical texts had described. He massaged Martha's abdomen, trying to get her uterus to contract, to clamp down and stop the hemorrhaging. "Stay with me," he said urgently. "Martha, stay with me. Thomas needs you. I need you. Don't you dare leave us now." Martha's eyes were fluttering closed. She was pale, so pale, her lips bloodless. The baby cried in her arms, and she tried to focus on the sound, tried to hold on. "Caleb," she whispered, "if I don't, you will. You're going to be fine. You're going to watch Thomas grow up. You're going to live in our homestead and grow old with me." His hands never stopped moving, pressing, massaging, desperately trying to stem the flow of blood. He thought of everything he'd learned, every piece of medical knowledge he'd absorbed in his desperate quest to prevent this exact situation. There was a technique involving cold compresses on the abdomen, using the shock of temperature to trigger contractions. He grabbed handfuls of snow from outside, wrapped them in cloth, and pressed them against Martha's belly. The cold was brutal, shocking, and Martha gasped, but it worked. He felt her uterus contract hard under his hands, felt the bleeding slow, and then stop. For several agonizing minutes, Caleb monitored her, waiting to see if the bleeding would resume. But it didn't. Martha's color began to return, her breathing steadied. She was weak, terribly weak, but she was stable. "You did it," Martha whispered, looking up at him. "You saved us both." Caleb collapsed beside the bed, his whole body shaking with the aftermath of terror and relief. "I almost lost you. God, Martha, I almost lost you. But you didn't." She reached out and touched his face with her free hand, the other still holding their sleeping son. "You kept your head. You used everything you learned. You saved my life and Thomas's life. You're a hero, Caleb Stone. I'm no hero. I'm just a man who couldn't bear to lose his wife. Sometimes that's the same thing." Caleb reached out and gently touched his son's tiny hand. Thomas's fingers wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength, and Caleb felt his heart crack open in a way it never had before. This was his child, his son, a living, breathing miracle that he'd been certain he could never have. "He's perfect," Caleb said, wonder in his voice. "He is," Martha agreed. "And he's ours." Outside, the storm was beginning to break. The wind died down, and through the window, Caleb could see patches of clear sky appearing between the clouds. Dawn was coming, bringing light after the longest, darkest night of his life. He cleaned Martha and changed the bedding, moving carefully to avoid disturbing her or the baby. Then he climbed into bed beside them, positioning himself so he could support Martha and see Thomas's small face. The cradle he'd built sat empty beside the bed, waiting. But for now, Thomas slept between his parents, warm and safe and loved beyond measure. "We did it," Martha said softly. "We actually did it." "We did it," Caleb echoed. And for the first time in 5 years, Caleb Stone allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a happy ending, not because tragedy couldn't strike again, he knew better than anyone that it could, but because he'd faced his worst fear and survived it, because he'd held death at bay through knowledge and determination and desperate love, because his son was breathing, his wife was alive, and the future they'd dreamed of was no longer impossible but real and tangible and theirs to build together. The storm outside had passed. Inside the cabin, a new day was beginning. 6 months had passed since that storm-torn August night, and spring had returned to the Montana mountains. The world was green and alive, bursting with new growth and possibility. Caleb stood on the porch of their homestead, truly theirs now, lived in and loved watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks. In his arms, Thomas gurgled and reached for the light, his small hands opening and closing like he could capture the sunshine. "What do you think, son?" Caleb asked. "Good day for planting?" Thomas responded with a stream of babbling sounds that Caleb chose to interpret as agreement. Inside, he could hear Martha moving about the kitchen, humming one of her old hymns. The smell of fresh bread and coffee drifted through the open door. It was a smell that meant home, that meant safety, that meant everything he'd thought he'd lost had somehow been restored. The cradle stood in the bedroom now, well used and bearing the marks of a baby who was growing fast. Caleb had carved Thomas's name into the headboard, along with his birth date. Below it, in smaller letters, he'd carved 3 other names: Sarah, Emma, and the unnamed son who'd never drawn breath. It was his way of honoring the past while embracing the present, remembering what was lost without being imprisoned by that loss. Dr. Halloway had arrived the morning after the birth, exhausted from his emergency in town and horrified to learn he'd missed the delivery. But his horror had turned to amazed respect when he'd examined Martha and Thomas and realized what Caleb had accomplished. "You saved them both," Halloway had said, shaking his head. "With nothing but knowledge gleaned from books and sheer determination. Mr. Stone, you're a better doctor than some I've known with formal training." The town's attitude toward them had changed as well. The story of the birth, the storm, the absent doctor, Caleb's desperate measures had spread through Bitterroot and transformed them from outcasts into something approaching legends. The mountain man who'd defied death to save his family, the woman who'd survived impossible odds, the baby born in a snowstorm and thriving against all expectations. People who'd once mocked Martha now greeted her with respect. Women asked her advice about childbirth, about marriage, about finding strength in difficult circumstances. She'd become, in her quiet way, a figure of admiration in the community. Caleb had made peace with his past as well. In early spring, he and Martha had ridden to the graves of Sarah and Emma, bringing fresh flowers, the first columbine of the season. "I'm sorry," he'd said to the silent stones. "Sorry I couldn't save you. Sorry I carried guilt for so long that I nearly missed the blessing right in front of me. But I want you to know I haven't forgotten you. I never will. You're part of who I am, part of what made me ready to love Martha and Thomas the way they deserve." Not asking for anything, just offering gratitude for the past and hope for the future. Now, standing on the porch with his son, Caleb reflected on how far they'd come. The dying town of Bitterroot had stabilized. New families, moving in to replace those who'd left. The homestead had become a gathering place, a symbol of what was possible when people supported each other through hardship. And his marriage, what had started as a practical arrangement born of desperation, had become the foundation of his entire world. Martha was his partner in every sense, the person who'd taught him that being broken didn't mean being beyond repair, that second chances were possible if you had the courage to reach for them. "Caleb," Martha appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Breakfast is ready, and we have visitors coming." "Who?" "Gus Mercer and his wife. They're bringing their daughter. She's about to have her first baby, and she wanted to talk to me about what to expect." Caleb smiled. This had become common people seeking Martha's wisdom, drawn by her gentle strength and her survival of what should have been impossible odds. He carried Thomas inside and settled him in the cradle while they ate. The baby was content, playing with a small wooden rattle. Caleb had carved the first of many toys he planned to make as Thomas grew. After breakfast, Caleb pulled Martha close, kissing her forehead. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Only twice," she said, smiling up at him. "Then I'm behind schedule." He kissed her properly, deeply, the way he'd been too afraid to kiss her in the early months of their marriage. "I love you, Martha Stone. I love the life we've built. I love watching you with our son. I love everything about the miracle you are." "We're both miracles," Martha said. "Two people who shouldn't have worked but somehow do. Two broken pieces that fit together perfectly." "Not broken," Caleb corrected gently. "Mended. There's a difference." Thomas chose that moment to demand attention, his cries insistent and loud. Martha laughed and went to pick him up, and Caleb watched them, his wife and his son, his whole world condensed into two precious lives. He thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago, convinced he was cursed, certain he could never be a father. That man seemed like a stranger now. Fear had ruled him. Grief had defined him. He'd built walls so thick that nothing could penetrate them, convinced that isolation was the only way to avoid more pain. But Martha had shown him a different path. Not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through quiet persistence, gentle strength, and the simple act of believing he was worth loving, even when he couldn't believe it himself. She'd given him back his life, and in return he'd given her a home, a family, a place where she was valued for exactly who she was. They'd saved each other. That was the simple truth of it. As the morning sun filled the homestead with golden light, and visitors arrived bringing laughter and conversation, as Thomas cooed in his mother's arms and Caleb felt contentment settle into his bones, he understood something profound. This was what he'd been broken for. All the loss, all the grief, all the years of believing himself incapable of fatherhood, it had all led here, to this moment, to this family. Without Sarah's death, he wouldn't have learned the medical knowledge that saved Martha. Without Emma's passing, he wouldn't have been in Bitterroot to meet Martha when she needed him most. He didn't believe in curses anymore, but he did believe in redemption, in second chances, in the possibility that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are preparing us for the best moments yet to come. "Caleb," Martha called from where she sat with the Mercers. "Come, tell them about the birth. They want to hear the whole story." He joined them, settling into his chair, and began to speak. Not about the fear or the terror, but about the triumph. About two people who refused to give up, who fought for their family with everything they had, who proved that love, real, tested, hard-won love, could overcome even the darkest circumstances. And as he talked, with Thomas sleeping peacefully nearby and Martha's hand warm in his, Caleb Stone finally understood what it meant to be whole, not perfect, not unmarked by loss or untouched by grief, but whole in the way that matters most, complete, loved and blessed beyond measure with a future he'd once thought impossible. The mountain man who said he'd never father children had become a father after all. And his wife, the woman the world had overlooked and mocked, had become the strongest person he'd ever known. Together, they'd built something beautiful from the ruins of their separate sorrows. A home, a family, a love that would endure whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. And that, Caleb thought as he looked at his wife and son, was the greatest miracle of all.